Hello and welcome to another book review. I just finished reading Clearing the Plains by James Daschuk. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this is a very heavy read. The historical context of how indigenous peoples were treated during the fur trade, leading into the railway and further colonization of our territories and regions. Like this was very difficult. So before I get too deep into this book review, I have to give a full disclosure that there is going to be a lot of explicit content. So definitely prepare yourself for that. Another disclosure I want to give before I get into this book is that I'm only doing this as a way of sharing my thoughts and feedback, sharing my perspectives of how I interpreted this book. This is my own worldview, this is my own perspectives, and some of it may be accurate and some of it may not, but I'm doing this as a way to share information with my audience, with people who are paying attention, so that you can witness and understand where my political views come from. You can listen and witness where my understandings of our history within this country comes from, and where that information came from as well. So I'm really trying to develop a strong sense of understanding and awareness and perspectives from concrete information, from scholars, from people who have done the work way before my time. And so as a result, I have developed a huge passion for reading books specifically that are telling the story of our indigenous history. And so one of the reasons I picked up this book is because I feel very, honored, and I feel very grateful that I had the opportunity to meet Nigon James Sinclair at an event that I was emceeing, and developing a relationship with him. I feel so grateful that I was able to have, those short conversations, but develop that connection. And, he's been a supporter of my Tribe Music platform. And so when I saw his name on this book as the opening done by him, I really got excited to read this book. I knew that it was going to be a good book and worth to read. So I wanted to kind of give you some of that pre-context of understanding my perspective of why I'm doing these things and how I'm going into this book. Another perspective is that I'm coming from an entrepreneurial perspective, from a lot of the things that I've read and learned in the last, 5 years. I really strongly believe that entrepreneurship is one of the means that we can actually achieve self-determination. It's a way that we can practice our own sovereignty and help achieve reconciliation within this country. So every time I'm reading a book, I need you to know that that's where some of my worldviews and my mindset and my perspective is coming from. And so diving into this book, right away on page 14, there was this really interesting perspective of what a middleman was. And a middleman are indigenous groups that took on the role as brokers between the fur traders and Europeans. And that to me was super fascinating, is that our value within the fur trade and within contact of European settlement, really we played a high value role in regards to, being a broker. Even that word is more modern considering the times that this book is articulating. And so to me, that was really cool to be satisfying my perspective of entrepreneurship right away. And so this, all of the middlemen who were involved in European trade at the time, they were highly valued. And that to me was so fascinating, that we were already entrepreneurial. We already took it upon ourselves to put ourselves in a position knowing that there is a mutual value that we can contribute and we can also benefit from. And that was really interesting to understand. And so putting that entrepreneurial perspective into practice here, only the strongest men and women took on the journey to and from the coast. So to me, this is kind of a radical and extreme perspective of entrepreneurship, but only the strong were the ones who survived that role. It was only the ones who had the ability to overcome all of the hardship that took place in developing those trade routes, in the long travels to and from the coast. Those were not easy, and a lot of death actually took place as a result of those long, hard journeys, and a lot of disease as well. And so to me, that is a radical perspective to kind of convey that even in our modern times, if you want to be a successful entrepreneur, you want to be successful in whatever it is that you're doing, you have to be willing to endure like the harshest environments, the most difficult times in order to be successful. Now, in this book, you know, considering the context of fur trade and environment and climate, you know, it's a little bit different. But I'm just putting into perspective that my entrepreneurship worldview, I was really excited to kind of learn that Indigenous people obviously played a key role in fur trade earlier on. So that was, you know, my perspective right away reading the first few chapters of this book. And another reason I bought this book was because I wanted to learn more about my own people, Nakota Assiniboine people. And the Assiniboine are constantly referenced in this book. Nakota tribe groups are also brought up in this book. And so I also bought this book to learn more about my own history of my own people. And so on page 32, it talked about a strong Assiniboine economy. And again, that was really fascinating with that entrepreneurial worldview on the top of my mind. And it was articulated that, you know, we had a dominant economic strategy on the plains by developing those relationships and taking the monopoly on supply and demand of the bison trade. So being able to capitalize on the bison trade to benefit our own indigenous groups with Europeans. The Assiniboine were known earlier on as having one of the strongest economic strategies of the times in the Plains region. And as a result, you know, the economic influence that the Assiniboine had over the Europeans played in our favor. And so again, like that perspective of entrepreneurship has been part of our history from a long time. Like this is going into early, like 16th, 17th century, 18th century. And so the fact that entrepreneurship was a huge part of our survival earlier on, I've just found super fascinating. So that took place, you know, really soon, really quickly in this book in the first couple chapters. One of the things that I mentioned earlier on was like the words being used in this book. I didn't know a lot of it, so I had to stop a few times to look up the definitions, and as a result, my vocabulary increased. But that was one of the hard things about reading this book is I had to constantly kind of stop and look up definitions. And so my learning was a lot deeper reading this book because I had to learn more just to understand what was being talked about. And so the one thing that kind of took me by surprise was some of the word choices in this book. You know, one of the word choices that really kind of stuck out to me was when it said Anishinaabe trappers brought their power, religious customs with them from the east, leaving evidence of their power for all to see. And the way that they incorporated religious customs associated to indigenous people, to me was like hard to kind of wrap my head around. It was hard for me to digest that in incorporating the idea of religious customs. You know, we were more spiritual, and the term religion came from Europeans. And so to incorporate and articulate that Anishinaabe trappers brought their powerful religious customs with them from the East, just, it made me cringe a little bit that the association between religious wording and indigenous peoples were kind of put together. That was kind of hard for me to read, understanding that religion is just the practice of spirituality and different beliefs and stuff like that. So I understood why that word was used, but to associate it with indigenous perspectives just was difficult. So that was one thing that stuck out to me in the overall context of this book. Like I said, this is a heavy read, so there's a lot of context. And I really want to do my best to share with you my perspectives of this, and also so that you're aware of why the topic of indigenization and decolonizing is so important and so relevant today, right now. This is to help you understand why that is so vital. So keep that in mind as we move forward. This is going to be a heavy book review, but to me, it's really important to share for anybody who's listening and watching these book reviews. In regards to entrepreneurship in the early days of the fur trade, you know, the demise of the fur trade was the result of overhunting, disease, and economic capitalism. And so during the time of fur trade and a lot of European settlement, the fur trade started to get oversaturated. There was overhunting of our animals, and as a result, those animals were depleted. As well, on top of the climate conditions, there was a lot of extreme weather conditions that was the result of a lot of disease and famine and starvation and difficulties in travel. Like, there was a lot of that happening earlier on. So the demise, you know, the kind of downward spiral of the fur trade was the result of overhunting, a lot of disease, and economic capitalism. So the European settlement really wanted to capitalize, of course, as much as they could over the fur trade. And as a result, like, the depletion of game was a constant problem. And so a lot of migration patterns were the result of chasing a lot of the fur trade and trying to find game to be able to capitalize economically. So that is something that really started to take place. And the monopoly of the fur trade, it was drastically oversaturated by European settlement going into the early and mid 18th century. And so the retreat, this is what I found interesting, is the retreat from indigenous groups led to a brief resurgence of economic prosperity as they began their own free trade between themselves. So, you know, the book started to kind of talk about that due to the oversaturated fur trade and in European settlement, we had to kind of pull back and try to find our own means of survival because it was so oversaturated and overdominated by European settlement. And so to me, the fact that we prospered when we pulled back and decided to trade amongst ourselves, I thought that was really important to highlight. So to me, that was really fascinating, is that when we as indigenous groups decided to pull back from our relationship with European trade, we actually prospered. We did better. We were better off. And so I want to highlight that because I think that is still very relevant today, that the way that our government societies are built, the way that this entire economy is built, is not in our favor. And as we continue to build nation-to-nation relationships, the better off we are going to be economically. So that is true then, and I think is still very true now. So I definitely wanted to highlight that. Trade between European colonies and the dependency on game drastically led to deadly disease, which continued to be devastating to all groups, both indigenous and Europeans. So to break that down, like the dependency on game, the dependency on the meat industry, the dependency on bison, the dependency on that trade between European settlement was drastically led to deadly diseases that continue to be devastating to both groups. The diseases were very contagious and spread to and from multiple indigenous groups and multiple European settlement as well. And so I wanted to highlight that because obviously the result of long travel, that's how diseases really started to kind of come into these regions and these territories. But to me, a lot of the deadly diseases that we experienced was due to European contact. And so if you look up the word allergy, like, it's a shock to your immune system, right? And like, the idea that we are allergic to European diseases is actually, to me, what that was revealing for me, in my perspective, is that we were actually allergic to European sickness and illnesses and diseases. We were just allergic. It was new to our environments. It was new to our immune system. And so it had deadly results. And so obvious reasons that it wasn't common to indigenous people, but also the dependency on game and the contagious illnesses that came from meat also contributed to high death rates. And so the disease of that animals also carried is also part of the contagious illnesses that killed a lot of indigenous groups and a lot of Europeans. And so I highlight that because to me, that's actually talking about our diet and our nutrition, is that even though game was something that we had to depend on for survival, we have to also look at the facts that as a result of our consumption of game, there was high death rates and disease. And so a lot of this continues throughout this book in regards to disease and contagions and all of these different type of like deadly experiences, both European and indigenous. To me was just like shocking, is like what the health and well-being of our people was drastically the result of what we were eating. This was worth highlighting in regards to our nutrition. And I think as we evolve as human beings, I think our ability to evolve our diet is going to increase our health. And so to me, I'm a plant-based eater, and reading this book really kind of helped me understand that the consumption of meat should be also kept to a minimum. A lot of disease gets transferred from our consumption of meat. And so that is what I really kind of took when I was reading that portion of this book, is how disease was spread through the disease of the animals. And so to me, that was an interesting perspective. And then, like I've been saying, like through desperate times, the emergence of the agriculture economy started to come in, but due to extreme weather conditions, it didn't survive long enough to build sustainable societies of indigenous peoples. And so this led to the further dependence on European trade, which then led to the oppression because Europeans began to take full advantage of indigenous shortcomings. So because we didn't have the ability to have long-standing agricultural economies, we had to continue to depend on fur trade, on the bison hunt, and all those things. And as a result of that dependency, European settlement really started to take advantage of our dependency because starvation was very common during those times. And so desperate times and desperate measures, we had to continue trying to develop our dependency on European trade just to survive. And now this is kind of where the story started to really get drastic. It really started to get explicit. And as a result of our dependency for our survival, this is how the Europeans started to kind of force us to sign treaties. A lot of treaties were not done voluntarily. They were done based on a mutual agreement that Europeans will provide us with a level of economic development, but also security protection of our well-being. That was what our indigenous perspective of treaties were, is that the Europeans promise our own economic development opportunities, as well as security and protection of our well-being, our health, our prosperity. That's why we agreed to sign treaties for that intention. Intentions were very clear from an indigenous perspective, that it was for the overall well-being of our people. And the fact that Europeans used that against us because they knew that we were starving and dying and they needed their food supply, they forced us to sign these treaties, which gave them a certain level of control, which continued to solidify our dependency with them. So that is where this book really started to change. And as a result, tools of genocide became food. Food became a tool of genocide, where they withheld food rations and they withheld the food supply to indigenous groups until they would sign certain treaties or until they would comply to certain things. And to me, that is so bad and so extreme. And to me, the fact that a lot of our death rates were the result of that. And so malicious tendencies of Europeans by forcing indigenous groups to sign over their land in exchange for food. That's why a lot of the reasons why we signed over our land rights was because we needed food, and the Europeans knew that, and so they starved us until we would sign over our land in exchange for food. And they fed on the desperation of indigenous peoples due to starvation and disease, and that wiped out thousands of indigenous groups throughout the region. That is devastating. And ongoing through that devastation and that constant battle between survival and European settlement, this is where anxiety started to increase in the sense of indigenous uprising. And so massacres started to take place in the late 18th century for the development of, during the time of Indian departments and the Indian Act and the colonization process. And so there's a thing called what ended up happening was the Sweetgrass Massacre, Cypress Hills Massacre. These things are mentioned in the book, and those things were due to the result of the relationship between indigenous groups and their they're really difficult situations they were in regards to food supply, and Europeans really trying to colonize these territories and trying to get rid of the Indian problem. And so the fear that indigenous people were to uprise against Europeans, a lot of massacres and a lot of policies and strict military control started to take place within our lands. And that just led to more death and more hardship. And so to me, this really helped me put into perspective the intentions of European settlement. It really put into perspective that indigenous genocide became forcefully intentional by the Europeans. One of the words that I used is, that I learned is extirpation. So the idea to root out and destroy. That was the intention, extirpation. If I'm even pronouncing that right, it's a new word for me. But understanding that word, to root out and destroy, to me encompasses the intentions of European settlement and the relationship with indigenous peoples, forcing the hand of indigenous groups to sign treaties as a hope for survival. That's what we thought we were engaging in, is a contract in hoping to instill our survival and well-being, which obviously was just a complete scam in regards to indigenous or European settlement of our lands. And so starvation and disease was rampant through the region, the introduction of cattle. So the idea of starvation became extreme. And as a result of these extreme cases of starvation, cattle from Texas, so cows are not native to Canada. They actually were imported from Texas in the late 18th century. And I'm not talking about just a couple handfuls of cattle. I'm talking about millions. This book talks about millions of cattle were imported in order to address starvation, because Europeans also had a difficulty with their starvation rate as well. And so again, this actually led to further disease. It led to new chronic and deadly diseases, and the digestion of disease and malnutrition animals was also fatal. So this whole book, going into depth obviously about indigenous groups and the fur trade, the bison trade, European settlement, during these times had a lot to do with disease and starvation and the manipulation of signing over our land due to health implications. These things were very intentional. And so bringing over cattle was their response and their way of providing some sort of a solution. But as a result, it just got worse. And so again, this goes back to our diet and our nutrition. If we're continuously eating food sources that are not native to our immune system, that does drastic health implications to you as a human being. And so to me, this is another way to continue to be plant-based, because the introduction of beef was also very fatal to our people. And so obviously immunity was developed over time, but it wasn't something that was normal in our diet. Cattle was not native to this land, bison was. So that was definitely something that stuck out to me. Now, to kind of get a little bit lighter, I got excited because for the first time, Ocean Man was mentioned in this book on page 119. And so my First Nation community is Ocean Man. I was hoping that there was a little bit more information in regards to, the territories in that region that were associated to Ocean Man. Obviously the Assiniboine people were involved, but there wasn't a lot of information on Ocean Man, which I was hoping for, but all good. I thought the fact that Ocean Man was even mentioned, I got to learn a little bit more. And unfortunately, the information in this book was just more devastation of death and starvation during those times. And so Ocean Man was mentioned in this book, which helped me kind of learn a little bit more of our role in that history. So that was interesting. Another thing that was interesting, we're like 3/4 of the way through this book review, but another thing that I found interesting was how food was stockpiled. Food became stockpiled as a way to continue to create dependencies of European settlement, and they were held in these large warehouses. So right away I was like, kind of like grocery stores, kind of like Costco's, you know what I mean? I think those are obviously more modern versions, but I think the dependency that human beings have on grocery stores, to me, stems from this kind of early stage stockpiling of food and the need of warehouses to store that food, and the dependency that we would have to go to those warehouses to get our food in order to survive because we didn't have the means to do it ourselves. So that to me, again, is like an interesting perspective of capitalism and how it kind of continues to play a role today. Like, how many people grow their own food? How many people have their own food sources? How many people know how to, develop their own agricultural economies? And so for me, that is something I'm very excited and passionate about going into 2020 is I want to explore more agricultural solutions and incorporating that into my life so that I can continue to practice my sovereignty because it's so important today. So that was super interesting. And as the book got into more and more depth of, the dependency of European food supply, this is where, the history gets really dark. I'm not going to get into it too much detail, but I think there is one part of this book, I'm already getting uncomfortable bringing this up and thinking about it, but one part of this book that gets really difficult is the situation that took place in the late 1800s. This is very devastating to learn about. So I think I'm gonna read a piece, like a few paragraphs of this book, and I think it's really important to understand. Now, in context, the Saskatchewan Herald, there's a lot of reference to the Saskatchewan Herald, which, helped to kind of capture a lot of these moments of history. And so European deaths were widely publicized, and Indigenous deaths obviously went on deaf ears. The murder of Indigenous peoples were kept quiet. That's done intentionally. Right? Intentions are very important. Now, here's where it gets real. I'm going to read directly from the book. The Prime Minister acknowledged the political importance of the executions, which ought to convince the red man that the white man governs. So, what they ended up doing was gathering as many Indigenous people as they could in the region, including the students from the Battleford Industrial School, and they were brought to witness the hanging and execution of our Indigenous people. And this is the hanging of Poundmaker. And there was more than just him there that were hung and executed. So they brought kids, little boys and girls, to witness this execution, intentionally to make the point that white men govern. Like, that is so infuriating that the European people of this time and era would think that they would do something like this to other human beings that were just trying to survive. So the executions of this era, of this time, led to like indigenous peoples backing up and really just giving in. Like that is devastating. And the fact that the prime minister made these executions intentional so that the red man knew that the white man governed, this is the foundation of this country. This is the foundation of Canada and how they got rid of the Indian problem. This is why the resurgence of our people is so important in today's day and age, in 2020. And so, as a result of this, sex trade of women as a desperate measure for food in order to avoid starvation also took place. So now the idea and the concept of missing and murdered Indigenous women play more of a key role in understanding how that came to be. The fact that our starvation of Indigenous peoples had led to the segregation of First Nation reservations intentionally done to keep us away from Europeans because of the fear and anxiety of our uprising. Like, that is the result of what we're dealing with today. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, suicide rates. A lot of our depression and anxieties are the result of this history. The result of this ongoing relationship of European settlement and Indigenous peoples. So for me, I'm even more passionate about doing everything that I can to restore the balance that is needed within our government society today. And when I say restore the balance, I mean the need and necessity for pluralism, an additional government body that is made up of Indigenous leaders in order to restore a lot of the broken nation-to-nation relationships that have been developed over time. That is something that I am more passionate about now than I've ever been, understanding the intentions of the early stages of Canada as a country. And so the fascinating thing about what this book captures is that the emergence of the ghost dance and sun dance were done in a way to defend ourselves against the devastations of death and murder by Europeans in the name of economic wealth control and land ownership. So as a result, we pulled back and we dived more deep into our ceremony as a way to protect ourselves and connect ourselves to the greater power, the creator, our spirit world, as a way to defend ourselves and equip ourselves with the strength needed to survive. You know, I think that just goes to show how peaceful we are as Indigenous people, how nonviolent we are as Indigenous people. And that was so fascinating. And so for me, that has very much encouraged me to dive deeper into my music as a form of telling this history, telling this story, inspiring our people. That has become even more of a passion today than it has ever been in my life, learning about this history. So that was extremely difficult to read, extremely difficult, especially learning all of these other things that led to this point that we're talking about in the book. And at the same time, like, residential schools were in full effect. And so reading that, understanding this that we're talking about right now, You have to understand, my grandmothers all attended residential schools on my mom's side. I have 3 grandmothers and they're all sisters. And so the rate of disease spread rampantly as residential schools were also created. And, you know, with cattle, milk was a huge cause of tuberculosis to children for decades. So again, like, malnutrition and mistreatment of indigenous young people are the results of colonialism of Europeans. And to me, this is another reason why I do not want to be consuming dairy products. I am completely turned off even further from consuming dairy products, learning this history. And the death toll of children at Capel Industrial School, which is one of the schools my grandmothers attended, the death rate was 20%. So to me, the trauma that my grandmothers experienced during these times, I can understand, not fully, but I can have an idea of how devastating and difficult it is to even talk about, because the intentions were so real in regards to the mistreatment. And I wish there was more perspective in this book about some of the allies in that time, because there had to have been somebody somewhere who cared about, you know, the mistreatment of indigenous people. And that was definitely missing in this book. There's a few mentions of a couple people, but more or less it was talking about the devastations that took place. And so learning about Capel Industrial School, where my grandmother attended, you know, was even more infuriating to understand the death rate of the children was at as high as 20%. And so later it was assumed, this is what blew my mind. Later it was assumed that disease was part of indigenous heritage. That's what Europeans started to come to realize. They thought that disease was our fault, that it came from our heritage and our genetics. And so further actions were put in place to continue to quarantine indigenous peoples. Reservations were enforced to segregate indigenous groups, and this led to the continuation of rebellion, but also led to further punishment and death of indigenous people. Those are a lot of words, heavy words, that if you can understand, like, the notion of indigenization is more important than it's ever been, because the foundation of this country is built in the way that we're talking about. The extermination of indigenous peoples, the quarantine of indigenous peoples, the mistreatment, the death rate, the starvation, the manipulation, like the segregation, reservations, were all done as a way to, like, literally colonize these territories and regions for their economical wealth, just for the economical wealth and like growth of their empires. That's disgusting to me. And I'm sorry to use such vulgar language to describe a specific group of people, but I'm doing it in context of our history. I'm not talking about modern times and referring to Europeans that way. I'm talking about that in context to this book. There are multiple allies in our current day and age in 2020. And that is what's hopeful. But I'm just, you know, emphasizing the urgency of revitalizing our ways and our societies and our own government structures. That's why, you know, the idea of resurgence and indigenization is so important today. And so that to me is so important to highlight. That's this book review in its entirety. It was heavy. It was a lot to read. It was a lot to take in. You know, this is a long book review, but as a result of this, socioeconomic dependencies are still relevant today. So indigenous groups, indigenous nations, indigenous communities are still very dependent on this European settlement, this Canadian society. And there are a lot of First Nation communities that are now becoming more self-government and applying their own governance structures that is definitely exciting to learn about in the book that I'm reading now, which is Where I Stand by Jody Wilson-Raybould. And so health rates are also the result of a lot of this history that we're talking about. Depression and just overall suffering of Indigenous peoples today is the result of how they were treated historically. And so government systems were built this way. And as a result, our fight to indigenize and change it will forever be our mission. The rise of female leadership will continue. I strongly advocate for a matriarch. The resurgence of our people will forever continue to rise until government reform and rebuilding of our nations becomes a state of balance. And that balance is giving us our sovereignty, our right to self-determination in a way that suits us, that fits us. And I'm not saying pull the carpet from underneath us and say, here you go. This is gonna take a gradual transition, but that transition is very important. And it's a huge necessity in order for the revitalization of our people to rise in a healthy way. So thank you, Clearing the Plains. Thank you, James Daschuk, for writing this book. Damn, it was a heavy read, and I'm heavy-hearted to read this book, but I'm also more passionate and driven now with a strong intention to inspire the revitalization of our people, the revitalization of our own government structures, because when we were dependent amongst ourselves, we prospered. When we worked together between nations, we were better off. When we developed our own agricultural economies, we were better off. And so again, I encourage everybody out there who's an aspiring entrepreneur to continue along that journey. I inspire you to continue to develop your business, to continue to develop your own self-sufficient strategies so that you can continue to feed your families. Entrepreneurship is one way that we can achieve reconciliation. It's another way that we can practice our sovereignty, and that is so important. That is so important. So I really hope that you took something positive away from this book review. It is difficult. It was a hard one, but you know, this is something I needed to learn. I needed to understand so that I have a clear vision of what tomorrow is going to be, what the future needs to be in order for Indigenous peoples to have their rightful place of belonging in this country. So once again, thank you for listening. I appreciate your time. I know this was an extended book review, but you know, I just want to share my learning and my growth with you. I really want to share, you know, a lot of the information that I've been learning in the late 2019, early 2020. And the book that I'm reading now is From Where I Stand by Jody Wilson-Raybould. And to me, that is like such an interesting book to pick up now, because I just read, you know, a late historical perspective and now getting into more of a recent historical perspective from a political standpoint, reading Jody's book. And to me, it actually is inspiring me to explore politics a lot more. I've always been against it because I had a brief understanding of our history, but you know, learning a lot more, like reading the Reconciliation Manifesto and now reading Jody's book, it definitely has inspired me to explore more of a political standpoint and how I can provide some type of support, or how I can continue to provide resources to help our communities be in a better place. So whether that's creating content, whether that's my music, whether that's doing workshops and presentations, that is what I'm really passionate about doing. And so again, I thank you for listening. I encourage you to explore your own methods of sovereignty, whether that's growing your own food, whether that's starting your own business. I encourage you to do that. And I encourage us as Indigenous peoples to put a lot of our hardships aside and learn how to work together between nations, between groups, between individuals. That to me is way more important than separating ourselves and, you know, just kind of turning our back on each other. I think we need each other more than ever. And the only way we're truly going to create positive, healthy change is when we learn to work together, because we all have something in common. And that's the health and well-being of our people. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next video.